So isolation was the first strategy of the government. Close the borders, keep people away from each other. Cinemas would close, theatres would close, churches would be regulated and possibly close, trams and trains would be regulated. Anything where crowding happened was going to be regulated. This had all been decided in November 1918. This shows 5 volunteer workers in Brisbane who are unidentified, unknown. It's a state library image. Of course, they're wearing the masks which characterised the influenza epidemic. The flu began in May, June 1918 and became the biggest pandemic outbreak of disease in history. It's called the Spanish flu because there was so much censorship in Europe that the English, French, Germans didn't want to report influenza outbreaks because they thought it would be demoralising, and of course it was. But the King of Spain, which was a non-combatant country, caught the flu and was a big news story, and people began to associate it with Spain. It probably began, like most flus, in China. It's always been intimately associated with the war. It had a big impact on ending the war because the armies were sick. In 1918, it affected young adults more than other people, and it affected young men particularly. So when you've got a lot of young men crowded in armies and moving in between countries and continents, you've got this perfect scenario for spreading the flu, and the flu became a pandemic, a worldwide epidemic. The Australian army suffered very badly with the flu. All the armies did. And the first Queenslanders, the first Australians to die of the flu, died in England and France in army depots and army camps. And several hundred AIF soldiers died of the Spanish flu. This is a photo of the Armistice Parade in 1918, and the women in white are Red Cross volunteers. And they play an incredibly important role in the fight against the flu when it gets to Queensland. The Red Cross had been set up, first established during the war. There were other women's groups, patriotic organisations like the Queensland Wattle League and the Comfort Funds, and quite a lot of different organisations. And the women who were in these groups, helping the war effort in their own way, had learned a lot of organisational competencies, how to be effective, how to run meetings, how to make schedules and meet schedules, and how to communicate. And those competencies came into play in the next disaster, which was the flu. I should say that Australia was the only country, the only major country that lost more soldiers than civilians. Most countries had a higher civilian death toll than a military toll. Because Australia volunteered in such great numbers and fought in intense battles, had a massive death toll, but our influenza experience was quite low compared to most other countries. We got it much later. We had a sophisticated, competent government, and we didn't suffer the flu as badly as other countries. It was our worst natural disaster, and it killed around 15,000 people in Australia. In Brisbane, it killed around 300, a bit over 300 people. These are 4 of the most interesting characters in Brisbane in particular, but also in Queensland during the flu epidemic. John Huxham, Home Secretary, had ministerial responsibility for police, for health, for prisons and asylums, and for local government areas. His wife had been trained as a nurse. She volunteered to go into the exhibition isolation hospital. When you were in this isolation hospital, you couldn't come out. So she was in there for 5 weeks while he was on the outside fighting the flu on a systematic Queensland-wide level. She was in there nursing people. Now, Dr. Helen Shaw, she had her fingerprints all over the epidemic too. As the epidemic was approaching, before it had come to Queensland, she was inoculating people And she was the head of the VAD, the Voluntary Aid Detachments in Queensland, which was a major part of the Red Cross. And she was working tirelessly to help prevent the flu arriving, and of course it was an impossible task, and to inoculate people for when it did eventually arrive. John McLean on the lower corner was superintendent of the General Hospital, the Brisbane Hospital, but when the Exhibition Isolation Hospital opened, he went over there and took charge over there. He had military experience during the war. And Charles Buchanan was the Mayor of Brisbane and became President of the Metropolitan Joint Health Board. Brisbane at that time was made up of 19 different local government areas. It hadn't amalgamated yet. And the population here was around 190,000. The first thing that happened when New South Wales declared itself infected with flu was that the border was declared closed. And the government brought a regulation in that the border was closed for anyone except locals along the border. If you lived within 10 miles of either side, you could carry on normal business and normal, activities. But 2 days later, at the very end of January, the border was closed completely. That's because there was no treatment for the influenza. Isolation was the main preventative measure. People knew about bacteria, they didn't know about viruses. And they thought that the flu was a bacteria. Viruses didn't become confirmed for several years. So they thought they were dealing with a bacteria. They had no medicine for it, no pharmaceutical kind of treatment. So isolation was the first strategy of the government. Close the borders, keep people away from each other. They made regulations so that when the flu was declared in Queensland, which didn't happen for a few months, that the schools would close, sports would be banned, cinemas would close, theatres would close, churches would be regulated and possibly close, trams and trains would be regulated. Anything where crowding happened was going to be regulated. This had all been decided in November 1918. And when those southern states said we've got the flu and they closed the border, all the regulations were already prepared. Within the very first day, people were crossing the border illegally and being arrested. And here's an item from Correspondence from the Home Secretary's Department referring to 3 railway workers who were arrested for crossing the border. Here is just a small fragment of quite a long document which lists a number of cases of people who had been arrested in different places and different ages and so on for crossing the border illegally. And there's too much detail on there to look at now. I just wanted to give you a sense of the kind of numbers that were involved and how busy the police were in trying to stop people crossing illegally. At that time, there wasn't anything, the government didn't have quarantine camps, but within a couple of days of the border being closed, there were quarantine camps set up at Coolangatta and Wallangarra. The idea was you would go into the camps and you would spend 7 to 10 days in the camp and prove that you weren't carrying the influenza germs. Then you'd be released. While you were in the camp, you would be inoculated. The inoculation was a 2-shot thing with serum that had been sourced in South Africa. You had 1 shot and then 7 days later you had the 2nd shot. The other thing that happened in the camp was an inhalation treatment where you would go into a room, a little box, and inhale this noxious gas, and the idea was that it would kill all the germs in your mouth and nose and throat. I think it was zinc sulfate solution. It was very It didn't kill anyone, it didn't really hurt anyone, but it was this noxious gas. And the idea was that if it smells bad enough and is noxious enough, it'll kill the germs and you won't spread them. Of course, flu is only spread person to person. This whole pandemic had gone from person to person, coughing, sneezing. Here are two newspaper articles from the same day, and they encapsulate why isolation was important, why quarantine was important. On the left, a brief summary of what happens in Samoa, where a ship was allowed to dock with influenza on it and was not forced to go into quarantine. Several weeks later, a quarter of the population is dead. Thousands of people are being buried in mass graves. Half of the government workers are dead. Thousands of orphans. Because influenza had been allowed to come in by a careless official. In Queensland, we've got the story of one character, Frank Ritter. He walks across the border looking for work. He walks between different towns in southern Queensland. He gets a lift, then he gets a train. The train ends up going through Toowoomba, Ipswich, Brisbane, up to Rockhampton. Then he gets another train out to Blackall, and all the way the police are tracking him and after him, and they end up catching him in Blackall. All of that effort has gone into properly isolating one individual who they know has crossed the border. And the difference is remarkable. In Australia, we have a very light death toll compared to our population. Samoa, complete disaster. Actually, the American Samoa had 0 cases of influenza because they had such a strict quarantine, and was one of the very few places in the world to have no Spanish flu. New Zealand copped the flu very badly. So it wasn't only, Australia didn't escape lightly because of the distance, we escaped because of good government. A couple of photos from the State Library of the bridge at Goondiwindi and the police station set up in the middle of the bridge to stop people crossing the border. And police officer in the middle, tall fellow with a slouch hat. I don't know why there are so many pairs of shoes lined up, but it's a great photo. And it's one of the bizarre things that happens during an epidemic when behaviour changes and people's activities. There's new types of behaviour during an epidemic, just as there is during a war. It's a kind of unique kind of drama. When the border was closed, there was a trainload of people coming back from Sydney, and they were taken off the train at Tenterfield and said, "You're not going any further till we sort this out." And they ended up camping in the local showgrounds, and they called themselves the Strandeds because they were stranded in Tenterfield. And here's a photo of Queenslanders who were caught below the border. Within a few days, as I said, the proper camp at Wallangarra had been set up, and there was a very large camp there, hundreds of tents, big cooking operations, very, very well done. This is a letter from police to the Home Secretary office, and it's about a situation near Coolangatta, a place, something ferry. It's about swagmen, and they were, vagrants, and they were crossing the border carefree up until the flu came along and disturbed their life. I drew it out because it's a police tracking people, following people, investigating people to see if they were a danger to the whole community. And I just love the charming era that there were still swagmen around. But in the close-up crop on the bottom, it says that when they're searching their camp, one of these swagmen are drowned. When they're searching the camp, they found socialistic literature. I thought he might be a Bolshevik. So 1919 is when the Russian Revolution is still reverberating, and there's actually Australian troops in Russia fighting with the English against the Bolshevik government. This is the year that the Red Flag riots happened in South Brisbane, and a lot of Bolshevik socialist guys were in Bogger Road Jail, and they were in jail when the flu arrived in Bogger Road Jail. Also in Bogger Road at the time were some of the border busters. So these were people who'd been arrested, charged and sentenced to prison for crossing the border. Here are 4 little fragments from a register of police correspondence, and picked them out again because of the kind of the historical idiosyncrasy of the situation. The top one is about an Aboriginal worker who'd been working with the police, taking care of camels, which were being used on the border patrol out in the far west of the border region. There's another letter later on talks about whether they're going to pay for the dead camel. One of the camels died while on patrol work, and the owner wanted to know whether the police were going to recompense that. Over here, young fella, 13-year-old Arthur Egan. He's been down in New South Wales working. He couldn't find any more work, so he was going to go home and see mum and dad. And he hadn't been keeping up with the newspapers. And he crossed the border, got arrested. 13-year-old fella out of work. A little while later, Gundawindi, I think it was, an 11-year-old girl, Rita Keane, crossing the border by boat. She's arrested. The police write to Toowoomba, what do we do? 11-year-old girl. Toowoomba says, let her go, quick. Bottom right corner, President of the Police Union writes, there's too many criminals in the Exhibition Isolation Hospital, and the police who are sick in there too don't want to be mixing with the crims who they've got professional experience with. So he wants part of the Petrie Terrace Police Barracks to be made a police-specific isolation hospital. They just give a brief snapshot of some of the strange work that the police were required to do in that period. This is a photo of the Brisbane Hospital a bit earlier, but that's the size. There was no more building between this image and the flu. Brisbane had several hospitals. It had 2 military hospitals, one of which was the Kangaroo Point Military Hospital, which is the Yungabar building, later became the Immigration Depot, and it's still there. The Mater Hospital, that's a postcard from that year. The Mater Hospital got hit badly by the flu, and a lot of its staff had gone over the hill to St Lawrence's College, because when the schools were closed, Archbishop Dewig said to the health department, would you like to use St Lawrence's College as a hospital, an emergency hospital? And of course they were glad to take up the offer. So some of the medical staff had gone from Mater over to the St Lawrence's College, and the photo I showed you before of the Dr. Helen Shaw, she was the superintendent of the emergency hospital at St Lawrence's. This is one of only 2 photos that I've found of people in Brisbane wearing the masks during the epidemic. Comes from the Mater Hospital archives. It looks like some of those people are wearing sunglasses. It's just a harsh shadow because it's taken at midday and the sun is directly above them. When you zoom in, you can just see eyes. They're not wearing sunglasses. One of the other military hospitals was Rosemount. And Rosemount was specialising in people who had come back crippled and limbless and blind and all kinds of grim injuries. And most of these staff are masseurs and masseuses, which is the physiotherapy of the day. Now, the flu got into Rosemount Hospital. The doctors and nurses were required to wear overalls with cloth boots and face masks and caps so that it was only their eyes accessible, and must have been nightmarish for some of these fellas in bed, sick with the flu, delirious, post-traumatic stress, probably, you know, battle fatigue, who had been gassed, to have these people coming in these uniforms that screamed danger and death. During the flu epidemic, they were setting up a limb factory at Rosemount where injured soldiers were making artificial limbs for other injured soldiers. So it was interrupted by the flu epidemic, but it was in play at that time. The Tivoli Theatre in Brisbane it's gone. It's where the big structure in King George Square is now, that kind of strange structure. And it was an inoculation depot. Because it was closed as a theatre, because all the theatres and cinemas were closed, it became an inoculation depot. Later on, they opened up because they thought they saw a gap in the rules. Theatres could remain open if they could open their roofs. Now, some theatres actually had opening roofs, and that allowed more ventilation and less exposure to the germs. And the Tivoli thought that because they had this kind of garden area up the top that they could open up, and they ended up being prosecuted for opening, breaking the regulations. But when they got to court, the epidemic was over and everyone was sick and tired of hearing about it. So they didn't follow through the prosecution, but they were charged with breaking the regulations. I don't know if that's legible to everyone, but this is just one tiny fragment of the massive regulations. The regulations covered almost every part of human activity, even down to how cafes had to wash glasses and plates and cutlery. It governed how many people could sit on a tram, how many people could sit in church, what was allowed and what wasn't allowed, and like I said, most public activities were banned. And this little fragment talks about the wearing of masks, and it didn't actually come into play, but it was on the books. Because Brisbane had a smaller population and a thinner population than Sydney and Melbourne, the flu wasn't as severe here. In Sydney, it was regulated that people in public had to wear masks, but in Brisbane, they had the regulation, but they didn't put it into effect. So you weren't forced to wear masks, but a lot of people did wear masks. You could buy a mask for £6 at any of the department stores, and early on they were also advertising veils for people who are more fashion conscious, and they were called yashmak veils. I don't think a veil has much effect against germs. You really need that close fitting thing. Of course, a flimsy mask doesn't have a lot of impact against viruses, but they were coating them in eucalyptus oil or menthol things, and they did have some preventative effect.
Your destination is on the left.
But people who were wearing masks still got sick. People who were inoculated still got sick and died. But with such a deadly disease, where you had been seeing newspaper headlines like 6 million dead in India, these were the kinds of headlines they were reading in Brisbane, you did anything you could. And wearing a mask was way better than doing nothing. So you can see it says, all or any persons in trains, trams, omnibuses, public lifts, the cabin of excursion steamers, ferry boats, upon wharves or adjoining premises, railway stations, classrooms, technical colleges, commercial schools, shops, banks, public offices, workrooms, anywhere where people got together, they were ready to enforce a rule that you had to wear a mask. Those were all the same places that had been closed or regulated. The Metropolitan Joint Health Board was established by the government to take care of Brisbane, the whole Brisbane region. And they took administrative control of the hospitals, the inoculation efforts, and they were made up. This gives an indication of the population distribution in Brisbane. So Brisbane City included the CBD, Spring Hill, Valley, Newstead, New Farm, and half of Kangaroo Point. So that's a big area, densely populated. They get 4 representatives. South Brisbane, which has West End, Woolloongabba, South Brisbane itself, part of Kangaroo Point, they only get 1 representative. And then all of these other areas have to amalgamate 2 or 3 or 4 to get 1 representative. So that just shows the spatial population distribution. And they are all those different local areas, the towns and the shires. The Home Secretary, John Huxham, had administrative oversight of everything to do with local governments, including the Brisbane local governments. He was, as I said before, he was in charge of the police, the health department, the prisons and asylums, and benevolent places, and local government. So he didn't have a minute to himself. So the flu was declared in Victoria and New South Wales at the end of February. And because we closed the borders and closed the ports, we kept it out of Queensland until the beginning of May. And the first cases were from the military hospital at Kangaroo Point. An influenza epidemic, as a graph, grows rapidly towards a peak and then recedes very slowly and gently. So from the 1st of May till the end of the first week, by the end of the first week, there were more than 20 nurses in Brisbane hospitals sick with the flu. Within a few weeks, there were 80 nurses sick with the flu. Nurses bore the brunt of the epidemic because they were in such sustained, intimate contact with patients. Doctors would float in and out of rooms. Nurses would stay in the room, dealing with people very closely. So it was nurses who were affected more than anyone else. They also had very strict rules to take care of each other, professional rules, and as soon as any nurse showed any symptoms, the other nurses forced them to rest. And of all the nurses who got sick in Brisbane, I could only find evidence of 3 who died. No doctors died in Brisbane. There were doctors in other places, like at Ipswich, the medical officer John Flynn died of the flu. So by 3 weeks into May, the isolation hospital at the exhibition grounds had been transferred to the control from the health department to the Metropolitan Joint Health Board, who were on the ground taking more local control of things. When the epidemic was threatening, in January, the RNA organisation said to the government, "You're probably going to need the exhibition grounds for an emergency hospital." And they started to get buildings ready for it. Poor old RNA didn't realise that the flu wasn't going to come for months. And then when it got here, it was going to stay for months. And it was the only year in the exhibition's history that there was no show. Like I said, the epidemic recedes very slowly and gradually, and it peaked in June, and it didn't. There were still cases happening in September, but very few. Basically, July, August, September, there were a handful of cases, but it was still in Brisbane. By that time, it was heading further up the state, out west, up north. One of the last places in the world to get the flu was Torres Strait Islands, and Thursday Island didn't get it until January 1920. Now, the Department of Public Instruction was the education department. All the schools had been closed instantly once the flu was declared an epidemic. And the one thing they did while the department was off work was prepared a booklet that's in the files here of invalid cookery. And they distributed this on a wide basis. I'll show you another document in a minute. But this is a little booklet with recipes. Now, as I said before, there was no treatment for the flu. There was no medical treatment. There was no pharmaceutical treatment. All you could do for flu patients was to feed them and keep them hydrated and keep them clean, and comforted, and try and encourage them to get through. So food was an incredibly important weapon against the flu epidemic. And the idea was that food had to be easy to eat and easy to digest. So very simple, bland, soft, mushy foods. That could be, if you got the flu, you weren't sitting up at a table, with your fine china and stuff. You were in bed, you were laid out. You didn't only need feeding, you needed someone to make sure you drank water. You also weren't going to the outhouse on a winter night when you were sick with this flu. So you needed someone to clean you. And the people who did that were your family. And if you didn't have your family, you relied on other people. In Brisbane, there was these women's organisations quickly sprang into action. And there were over 1,000 women in Brisbane who were part of a thing called the Women's Emergency Corps. It operated in every suburb, every part of Brisbane. And it was a very formal group. It had rules, regulations, it had armbands and badges. And in some places it had a different name. In South Brisbane and Stevens area it was called a Vigilance Committee. But most of Brisbane it was called the Women's Emergency Corps. And these were women who patrolled the streets. And there were lots of boys and school teachers also patrolling the streets. But people would go up and down each street looking for people who needed help, people who were dying. And they were given cards. And each house had 2 cards. One said SOS and one said food. If you put out your food card, it meant you just needed food. You didn't want to mix with people. You didn't want more germs coming close to your house. But if you put out your SOS card, it meant you're in trouble. You need a nurse or a doctor or an ambulance. So these women were putting on their flimsy little muslin masks, and they were going into houses where the deadliest disease in history was making people gravely ill. And they were feeding them, and they were making them drink a bit of water, and they were cleaning them and doing their laundry, and just sitting with them and talking to them and comforting them. And that was all that could be done. So they were doing life-saving work on a heroic scale because they were dealing with something deadlier than the war. But they were doing it in every house, in every street. And like I said, there was over 1,000 of these women in these groups. So cooking cooking, feeding, laundry work. That was the fight against the flu in Brisbane. It wasn't doctors, it was nurses and ordinary people rolling up their sleeves, doing simple work, but some of it very disgusting work, to keep people alive in every house who didn't want to go to hospital because hospital was the deadliest place you could be during the epidemic. Now here's a document about the distribution of that pamphlet. Government Printing Office has done a first run of 7,500 copies, 20 copies sent to every local authority, hospital, ambulance brigade and benevolent society. They're a very rare thing. The State Library doesn't have a copy. I've never seen a copy for sale anywhere, but the Archives has at least one copy. This is a photo of one of the emergency groups at Ithaca. So Ithaca is the Paddington Red Hill kind of area. And you can see these signs on the front of the cars, SOS and food signs. And you can see all the boys with their bicycles. So the boys who were off school were doing this patrol work, and they were saying to the women, number 43 needs help. Number 12 has an SOS sign out. So scout groups were doing it, also teachers were doing it. State school teachers were doing a lot of this patrol work. Most people didn't have a car in that time. Most of Brisbane was still horse-drawn. And there were calls from mayors and from council saying, anyone with a motor vehicle who's willing to give us a couple of hours use of it, can you get in touch? We need food driven around, or we need patients taken to hospital and stuff. Now this is the same group of people after the epidemic's over, gathered for a portrait, and this particular image was given to the Mayor of Ithaca as a commemorative gift. And it's a pretty blurry photo, but someone else took another photo of the same group a minute later, and with a big glass plate camera. So it's a big glass plate negative and very, very high resolution. And this is the back cover of my book. It's a crop that shows the women and the nurses and the boys, some of whom have their armbands on, and the food signs. And some of those boys would have grown up to be the generation that went off to World War II. But that's who fought the flu. And they had these groups in other places like Maryborough and Toowoomba as well. Any town that was big enough, where there was a big enough population. So Maryborough had an isolation hospital in their showgrounds too. Schools all over the state were turned into emergency hospitals because you didn't want your normal patients mixing with flu patients because they were already sick, they were already in trouble. So hospitals were set up in schools all across the state. At the end of which you would need to disinfect them, and there's another effort cost for the government. This is just in here because it's such a rare photo of the flu team at Canungra with their ambulance and their protective caps. At the end of the flu, you need to account for it. There was a cost. The government did arrive at a cost. I can't remember the figure right now, but it was something that sounds surprisingly modest. I think it was £150,000, which doesn't sound like a lot of money. In Brisbane, there were 310 or so deaths. In Queensland, around 1,000. If you scale Brisbane's population up to today's level, there would have been days when 40 or 50 people a day were dying of the flu in hospitals. As you can imagine how grim that would be.
Can you just read what it says for Nakundra, please? It's a tiny little place.
Nakundra?
Yeah, Nakundra.
It says 33 feet of rope and 2 lines, and they were worn out on Border Patrol. But most of it's just put in there because of how quirky it is. It's bicycle saddles, bicycle pumps, and these bicycles were used, also camels and also horses. were used on the border patrol. I thought when I got here and looked in the prison records, I would find grim stories of epidemics in prisons where the whole population is crowded and confined and can't escape. What I found was actually that prisons fared very well. Even though the young men in prison were the prime group for infection, prisons had medical officers who told you what to do. And they had a massive over-application of disinfectant. So prisons did very well overall. There were very few deaths among the prime infection. In the group at risk of infection actually didn't die as often as I had expected. So there was a surprise in the records. St Helena in Moreton Bay remained completely free of the flu. Bogger Road did have some cases and one death. As I said before, some of these Bolshevik, the red flag rioters, were in Bogger Road at the time, but also quite a few people who were border busters who had been arrested crossing the border. They got to the Bogger Road around the same time the flu got to Bogger Road. Now, the other government agency I want to talk about quickly is the Chief Protector of Aboriginals, who had responsibility for every single Aboriginal person in the state, every single Indigenous person in the state. And there were 3 government settlements and a whole lot of religious missions. The government settlements were Baramba, which is now Cherbourg, Taroom, which later closed and the people walked from there to Woorabinda, and Palm Island. Palm Island had a very slight experience with the flu. Baramba and Taroom had complete disasters with the flu. They were both closed, officially closed. The only person allowed in or out was the visiting doctor at each place. But of course, you can't fence people in completely. And maybe the doctor brought it into each place. No one will ever know. But Baramba had a population of 600 people and 90 people died in 3 weeks. 1 in 6, 1 in 7 people died in 3 weeks and were buried in mass graves. Taroom, the population was much smaller, but the death rate was even a little bit higher than that. They only had around 120 people at Taroom. I can't remember exactly how many people died, but it was getting on towards 20% of the population in a couple of weeks. So there's a register here, the Chief Protector's Register of Deaths, and it itemises every death of every Indigenous person known in Queensland. What their name was, how old they were, where they died, when they died, what they died of. It's a big register, and you flip through the pages, and there's different people, different times, different places, different dates and causes. And then you get to this one, you turn a page, and it's all Baramba, all the same time, all the same cause. And the pages become essentially, they look almost blank, but it's because it's such a concentration of mortality of one cause at one time in one place. And it's a very stark picture, an image of the epidemic in Queensland. Overall, Queensland fared very lightly in a country that fared very lightly. There was no other country, no other comparable country had such a light experience of the flu. But Taroom and Baramba had disasters as bad as almost any other place on the planet.